per request, I had to try out a water spell build. People were constantly telling me this build did insane damage and could kill bosses in literally 2 shots. I've tested this out for myself, and this build is the build to use against bosses, almost point blank period. This build does so much damage in such a short amount of time, it's not even funny, and the ice spells for this build don't even get me started. As you can see, I'm wiping bosses so easy, literally it's not even funny. And this is footage from New Game Plus, so this build works in the regular game as well as New Game Plus. That being said, scroll down and subscribe to the channel below and like the video really quick. We're going to get right into the setup of this build and how it works. So currently the gear I'm running are these dual swords. These dual swords are great and scale with water, which is obviously perfect for this build. If you look below, I have a solid locked on stat for melee attack spirit damage. I then put ice attack power obviously on this build to make my ice spells that much more powerful. Now if you have any available, you're definitely going to want to drop on one of these special effect items. Primarily something like damage amplification on enemy upon martial arts hit. Due to the way this weapon is set up, we have a melee attack spirit damage effect locked on the weapon. I then put ice attack power on the weapon. And the only other 2 raw options I had were enemy status effect accumulation, which is going to be good because we want to keep ice accumulation on the enemy, as well as spell duration, which increases the duration of positive effects. I have the Gooting Blade as the secondary on this build. I have the Gooting Blade as a secondary mainly to deal with human enemies, as otherwise I wouldn't really use the secondary much anyways. It also doesn't matter what bow you have on this class. Now as you can see, I haven't upgraded this bow, which I'm going to do, and obviously you're going to want to upgrade it as far as you can, because once you get up to, for instance, a higher level ranged weapon, this build scales a lot with range. Even though we're not going to use it, sometimes we may use it. So whichever active ranged weapon you have that you're going to be using consistently, make sure you have effects on, because the active selected ranged weapon does give its effects over to your character. As you can see, we have repeating crossbow damage locked on this. I then put ice attack power on this weapon, as well as flame attack power and damage received. Now most ranged weapons have a locked damage buff, but if they don't, make sure to put a damage buff here instead. Next we're going to move on to the armor set that was used. So this is where you really have a choice. So I used a medium armor set, the Blue-Eyed Child set. This gives you the inheritor of the Tiger set bonus, which can be gotten from making Sun Quan a sworn brother and getting his oath level to level 10. The set bonuses for this include ammo held max additionally by 2, ammo retrieval upon ranged attack, less martial arts consumption, and melee attack damage. Now I went with this build for the meantime specifically because I already had it available, and its medium armor giving me a little more protection. Ideally, once you unlock it, you're going to want to use the Libationer Guo set. This is a light armor set that grants the set bonus of Strategist of Genius. It's going to give you enemy status effect accumulation, a damage amplification effect, negative effect duration on the enemy, and damage to enemies with negative effects. This is by far the best set you want to use, but that's the set you're going to want to use. That being said, I've put all the effects on this gear that you're going to want to put on your set once you get the Libation or Guo set. So as you can see, this set comes with Fatal Strike damage, which is fine. I've put Ice Attack power on this build. Also, Wizardry spell spirit consumption I've decreased mainly because you're going to be casting a lot of spells, so you're going to want to consume as less spirit as possible. I've also added damage amplification upon fatal strike on enemy, meaning when we do a fatal strike, we're going to do increased damage for a certain period of time to enemies. Here again, I've put ice attack power, and where possible, I've put increased HP damage dealt to enemies afflicted with negative effects. This is going to be big because we're always going to have an ice effect on the enemy, so this is going to give us increased damage to a much higher degree by having this effect. You're going to want to have ice attack power and damage to enemies with negative effects on every piece of gear that you possibly can. Additionally, I've used Wizardry spell spirit consumption and flame attack power for some of our skills. Again, you can see I used ice attack power, damage to enemies with negative effects, Wizardry spell spirit consumption, and a power gain effect. And finally on this piece, I only put the items that I could put. So again, I put attack power for ice and damage on enemy with negative effects, as well as water phase spell spirit consumption and chill accumulation on enemies. Now I didn't have great accessories, but the ones I did use are these turtle looking seals. The main point here giving me Wizardry spell damage plus 2.5%, which is big, and damage dealt 1.8%. Like I mentioned, you're going to get even bigger buffs using the Libation or Guo set. As you can see my stats here, I currently have 78 water virtue, 15 earth virtue, and 30 fire virtue. Now I'll show you the other battle set in a second, but what I've been doing is running 2 battle sets primarily for this reason. This specific skill setup is made for boss fights particularly and doing big damage during boss fights. I currently don't have a ton of points in Metal Virtue because I want to be able to move around, but ideally you're going to want to stack some points in Metal Virtue to reduce your wizardry spell consumption. But again, the spells in this particular setup don't necessarily require a ton of that, and I run 1 battle set for bosses and 1 battle set specifically for other enemies, mainly because the spells in this build require pretty high morale to cast, and you won't have any of them available pretty much throughout the early on or middle of missions. Now the spells I'm currently running on this setup is Overpower Burst, Amplify Damage, Ice Weapon, and Ominous Chill. So as a lot of you are probably familiar, this is one of the most OP combos in the game, and how this works is you cast Amplify Damage, you then cast Overpower Burst. This makes it so it increases the damage you deal to enemies, as well as Overpower Burst then greatly increases the damage dealt by the next spell or martial arts ability used. You then follow this up by hitting the enemy with Ominous Chill, doing the insane amount of damage it already does, with both the prior effects activated. Now the setup, in case you need to use your melee weapon, we have Ice Weapon, so it gets the best amount of damage buff from your already overpowered ice stats. Now the big reason here why this is so OP is you can use Amplify Damage followed up by Overpowered Burst to boost your potential damage for your next skill, and then cast Ominous Chill on the enemy to literally take down boss's health by 50%. You can then just keep casting Ominous Chill or cast an Overpowered Burst and then Ominous Chill again. Either way, you do an insane amount of damage and is a great way to get a ton of XP and 5-star gear. You can keep doing this to bosses of literally every type, and it does so much damage. Bosses literally can't keep up with it. That's why no matter how great other builds are, and there are a lot of good ones out there, this is definitely the most damaging. You can see against almost any boss, this does a ton of damage. Even enemies with ice resistance, this still does an insane amount of damage when comboed together. You can also use your melee enchantment to enchant ice onto your melee weapon in case you need it, but more than likely with this build and with these set of skills, you're definitely not going to need it at all. So now we're going to go over a separate skill set that is going to be best used for actually questing and running around in the game. So the set for regularly questing or adventuring through levels is Ice Weapon. This is great to do additional melee damage to enemies. Once you reach morale rank 15, obviously it will annihilate any enemy you walk upon. Frozen Malice, it is another low morale rank skill that you can use to your advantage. So that way, even at morale rank 3, you're going to have an ability that you can use consistently. And Venom Snare. Venom Snare is obviously the best toxin ability in the game, especially against tons of different mobs. When you cast this on one, it will create an area effect around that mob and do damage to all of them at once. The skills that we have for this regular adventuring setup are a little bit different. So you're going to want to use the last setup for bosses primarily if you can, and then use this setup for regular questing. So 84 Water Virtue here. Metal Virtue, you don't necessarily have to have a set amount, but just enough that your wizardry spell consumption goes down quite a bit. As you can see, mine's currently at 70%. And then I also have 9 points in Earth Virtue. If you're using the Libationer set, you don't need that and can reallocate those points. That's just because I'm using medium armor and I'm wanting to stay on B agility. Now, one of the big things to take advantage of in this build is your high stealth rating. So your high stealth rating is going to give you much bigger damage on fatal strikes, meaning if you can sneak up on enemies and deal fatal strikes to them, you're going to be doing an insane amount of damage. You can see jumping here on top of a boss doing a fatal strike, I almost defeat this smaller boss in one hit, as well as this guy, which are generally harder enemies, just because I do so much damage. I did 1500 damage there. That's literally insane. And keep in mind, this is in New Game Plus, extremely easy. And you can see you can use this attack to run at enemies and spam the block mechanic so they don't actually see you and you stay in stealth mode, and then walking up on them. And as soon as you get close in the prompt to actually do a fatal strike on them, you can do that and literally take out enemies super easy that way. As long as their back's turned towards you, you can just run at them and spam the block mechanic and eventually hit them with that, and they're as good as gone. Next are some basic ice spells. So you can see this is a level 3 ice spell. You can use this to supplement magic and damage earlier on in quests and maps. This is going to give you an ability to use that you can use consistently early on with enemies, and even use to counter certain enemies and other bosses where you can just destroy their spirit meter by literally a ton. Again, in this skill set, we're also using the weapon enchantment for ice weapon because you do so much additional ice damage on your melee weapon when actually using this, and it's only morale rank 7, meaning you have early access to this skill, making it a must-have for normally running the game. Additionally, you can use the Gooting Blade to beat normal human enemies and regular bosses, so it's always great to carry as a secondary, meaning you can just deplete people's spirit meter like instantly, and you can spam this over and over. Again, on human enemies. If you like this build, make sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't below, and give me any feedback or comments you think could make this build even better. I know using the light armor is going to potentially increase the max damage you can do by actually a decent bit. That being said, thanks.